Mr. Vincent Forrest, EuroMed Rights Brussels Director, you will focus, I know, on the situation of women in the southern part of the European Neighbourhood Policy. So we look forward to hearing what you have to say on the role of women and on how European Neighbourhood Policy contributes to promote gender equality in those countries. So, Mr. Forrest, you have the floor.
I'm going to speak in English. So indeed, my name is Vincent Forrest from EuroMed Rights, and before presenting the organization in a few words, I'd like to say I'm pleased to contribute to gender balance on the panel, and I'll try to speak not as slowly as possible because that would take 2 hours, but I'll do my best, so tell me if I'm too slow. So EuroMed Rights, actually, it's the EuroMed Mediterranean Human Rights Network. It's a network of around 70 organizations based both in Europe and in the South. So it's 50-50. So that makes the organization unique because we can really bring the EuroMed perspective into the policy, including the European Neighbourhood Policy. I guess I've been invited because we've been following the ENP for a long time now, particularly the revision last year, and with the communication published last November. So we have a working group, actually, working group with mixed composition. We have, as I said, half from the EU, the other half from the southern partner countries, but we focus a lot on the situation in the southern countries, particularly with a clear focus on violence against women. So I'd like to say that we have to recognize that since the particularly the Arab uprisings, but even before that, there have been some positive developments, and particularly legislative changes, like progressive constitutions in Morocco in 2011, in Tunisia and Egypt 2 years ago. It was late, well, even before the revision of the family code in Morocco. There are laws prohibiting female genital mutilation in Egypt in 2008. Laws on domestic violence in Lebanon in 2014, in Algeria last year. And there are even more comprehensive laws on violence against women that are being passed in Morocco this year and in the making in Tunisia, as you may know. But as you can imagine, there are still a lot of challenges, and I say that we have a working group on women's rights and gender equality. I should have said gender inequality in the region, because most of the partner countries in the South, they have ratified CEDAW, but with a lot of reservations on key articles. That's an issue. There are a few exceptions, like Tunisia, who lifted the reservations 2 years ago, and the State of Palestine, who ratified CEDAW without reservations also two years ago. So there have been apparent positive legislative changes, but many of the laws, including on violence against women, are very limited in scope. And to answer your question about maybe the gap between the policy making and society, not civil society, but society in different countries, actually the legislation reflects conservative and conservative family values rather than taking on board human rights based approach. So another big challenge, as you can imagine, also is the implementation in practice. And I'd like to mention that despite the fact that in Egypt adopted in 2008 a law prohibiting female genital mutilation, very young women, a 17-year-old Egyptian girl, died at the end of May following a surgery, complications after undergoing circumcision surgery. So there are problems, of course, despite. So as you said, legislation is not the end of something, it's probably the beginning, and the more important thing is to look at the implementation in practice. But there is another major challenge, and I'd like to come back to what Mariana said about the fact that women are targeted not just because they are human rights defenders, but because they are women. So they face double stigmatization, discrimination, and they face threats, gender-based threats, and they face attempts to discredit their work. And these threats are targeted towards their honor or respectability. So it's clearly a common challenge, East, South, and I should say including in the EU member states and elsewhere on the planet. So our colleagues, our members in the South, they they're openly talking to us about backlashes to the gain obtained over the past years. So the fact that there is legislation, more positive legislation, doesn't mean that it's better in practice. But above that, women's rights defenders, they are targeted, they face backlashes because of this legislation, because there is a reaction by society or by segments of the society. Now I'd like to talk about the EU international instruments about women's rights in the EU, well, particularly dealing with the ENP. As far as we know, there is no specific instrument dealing with the region, the southern partner, the EuroMed partnership. So we have to look at the global instruments, like the Gender Action Plan. Maybe my neighbor will talk about the Gender Action Plan number 2, which is good, actually, because it says that gender analysis will be systematically made in all external actions of the EU. And we see positively the focus on shifting the institutional culture in the European Commission and the External Action Service, with commitments to gender equality translated into clear outcomes. So again, that we have to see what it means concretely on the ground. But we believe in terms of recommendations, I would say we believe that it is very important to have a clear monitoring mechanism. It's the same with the legislation, how it's implemented in practice, how the Gender Action Plan will be implemented in practice, because I know that for the first version of the Gender Action Plan, there were shortcomings. And the gender mainstreaming was not really mainstreamed throughout the institutions, and it was a clear shortcoming of the first Gender Action Plan. That's why, as I just said, the threats, the fact that women are delegitimized, I think the EU should focus a lot on the protection of women's human rights defenders. It's not just mainstreaming the approach, but protecting individuals, in line with the EU guidelines on human rights defenders and those on violence against women. Now, in the revised ENP, it's good to see that there is a reference to the Gender Action Plan. It's not bad. There is a clear angle dealing with women's rights. And as far as I know, the EU is now negotiating with a few South Mediterranean partners, Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt, soon Algeria. And I've heard that women's rights will be there as a partnership priority or as a cross-cutting theme, which is good. But what is very important to do is to keep strong gender indicators and women's rights indicators in the partnership priorities themselves, but also how they are implemented and report on the implementation. It's also for us very important and crucial that advancements in the rights of women continue to be an integral part of the EU's privileged partnerships, particularly with Morocco and Tunisia. For example, in Morocco, a law on violence against women was recently passed, but the content of the law is far from being satisfactory. And in Tunisia, what we call the loi intégrale on violence against women was seriously watered down before being passed by the government. So there's still a lot of challenges. But I'd like to finish with a reference to the Convention of Istanbul, the Istanbul Convention on Violence Against Women. Why? Because it's the first legally binding instrument, and so far the most comprehensive instrument in Europe. But as you may know, it's open for ratification, not just for the Council of Europe member states, but also to other countries, including southern and eastern Mediterranean countries. And I've seen that last March the Commission proposed a Council decision on ratification by the EU of the Convention. And I'd like to let you know that in the autumn we're going to launch a public campaign on the Convention to raise awareness among civil society, because there is a lack of knowledge and visibility of the Convention among civil society in the South. And we'd like also to influence national governments to implement the provision of the Convention. Because it's not enough to sign and ratify the Convention. The key thing is, of course, to implement the provisions around the 4 Ps of the Convention: prevention, protection, prosecution of perpetrators, because impunity is another big challenge, and finally, integrated policies. And we're going to target 6 countries, 3 in the north, France, Cyprus, Turkey, and 3 in the south, Morocco, Tunisia, Jordan. The 3 in the south have not ratified the Convention. Cyprus has signed but not ratified. France and Turkey They have ratified, and it has entered into force. Why France and Turkey? Because there are a lot of shortcomings, including in France. If you look at the percentage of convictions, I was talking about impunity. The number of convictions compared to the number of complaints, it's ridiculous. So I think it's an issue not just for the Eastern partner countries and the Southern partner countries, but also it's an issue for the member states themselves. So that's why we want, as I said at the very beginning, bring that EuroMed perspective, not just talking to our colleagues and government in the South or East, but also talking to colleagues and talking to governments within the EU. Finally, I've brought with me a few copies of country fact sheets, again to answer your question about data, etc. I don't know if there are still copies left, but I'm happy to send the fact sheets to the FEM Secretariat so we can distribute them. So there are fact sheets on Egypt, Palestine, Morocco, and Tunisia, describing the situation in legislation, in practice, and providing facts and figures on these 4 countries. And I stop here. Thank you for listening.